Thank you for inviting me. I Jess asked me to come and talk about the militarisation of space. I mainly work in new military technologies, but have specialised in space ethics for about the last 10 years. We only have a really short period of time, so strap in. This is going to be rapid fire. You're going to get a whole heap of information all at once, and I hope you have some good questions at the end. So here we go. So the first question would be, how long have we had a militarization of space? When we talk about the militarization of space, it comes with a whole heap of ideas behind that the idea that the militarization of space is bad. And I think actually part of that problem is a misunderstanding about what the militarization of space means. How long has the militarization of space been going for? Well, it started at the very beginning in 1957 with Sputnik. Sputnik was a military satellite, and so right from the very beginning of our avenues into launching into space, space has been militarized. When people are talking about the militarization of space, though, what they're often talking about is the personnel in space. Now, the very early astronauts and cosmonauts were military men and one exceptional Soviet woman. And many of them were Navy test pilots. This here is an example of that continuing today. So this is astronaut Matthew Dominic, and he's currently on the International Space Station. And I know you aren't supposed to have favorite children or favorite astronauts, but he is currently my favorite astronaut in space. So he's currently on the International Space Station, and he's a prolific astrophotographer and he posts his photos very soon after he takes them on Twitter and engages with people on Twitter from the International Space Station. So if your life goal, one of your life goals, is to interact with an astronaut actually in space, as is mine, you can follow him, and he's absolutely wonderful. He is also, however, a Navy commander and test pilot with 61 combat missions. So the idea of military staff, military personnel working in space started in 1957 or soon after that, and has continued on until today. And we see that with the Russian cosmonauts, we see that with the Chinese astronauts, and we see that with both US and other personnel from different space agencies. So when we're talking about the militarization of space, we really aren't talking about the militarization of space. What we're actually talking about is the weaponization of space. When people in the general community get concerned and start asking difficult questions about the militarization of space, what they're actually really at the crux is talking about the weaponization of space. So I'm going to take you through very briefly about what weapons are currently and planned in space in an unclassified manner, as is all of my research. So, question, are there any weapons in space? Currently, are there any weapons in space? So when you think about weapons in space, you think about generally, you think about big destroyers. So these are from the movies series Star Wars, but this is the kind of thing you're thinking of, something like this or something from Battlestar Galactica. We think of large weapons in space, but currently we don't have anything like that up floating around. So it leads us to ask questions about whether there are smaller weapons available in space. Now, this is a lightweight axe just taken randomly off an internet seller. Apologies, I haven't put up where you can buy it. But it asks the question, it prompts us to ask the question, are there things in space that can be used as a weapon? This is, I suspect, an apocryphal story, but it's been told to me so many times I think it might be true, that a Russian cosmonaut attacked another cosmonaut with an axe because he went crazy. But the way he attacked the other cosmonaut was with an axe that had been on that particular space station. It was pre-ISS. in case of fire to get in between different sections. So the question is, I'm sure there are lots of things that could be used on the International Space Station as weapons against another astronaut. And I'm sure you're all sitting there thinking of things that you could potentially use as a weapon, because that's the kind of people that we are, I guess. But then on Earth, anything can be used as a weapon. So yes, there are things that can be used as weapons in space, but that's kind of not what general society is worried about. They want astronauts and cosmonauts and Chinese astronauts to get on and not hurt each other. So they'd rather things not be used as a weapon in space. But when they're thinking and talking about weapons in space, really what they're talking about is weapons that have the capacity to kill a large number of people, weapons of mass destruction. So the question is, are there any weapons currently in space that could cause wholesale devastation on Earth? And I think currently the answer is no. And that's for a whole heap of reasons, most largely because it's actually very difficult to get heavy weapons, heavy things into space. It's very expensive. I would imagine, well, I know there is a lot of G-forces on anything that goes into space. And I would imagine that something as careful as a nuclear weapon, you'd be worried about it going off before it actually reached up into orbit. So they haven't yet worked out how to put weapons of mass destruction into space. However, there are things in space that can cause wholesale damage. So I'm assuming all of you understand the principles of jus ad bellum and jus in bello. In this case, we're talking about jus in bello, discrimination and proportionality. When a weapon is used, it needs to be used discriminately only against a legitimate military target. And in particular, care needs to be taken that it doesn't impact either through death and destruction or through second and third order effects on civilians. There's also proportionality. We need to ensure that if we are using a weapon on Earth or in space, that it is proportional in the impacts of it. Now, part of the problem we have with weapons in space is that because space is used by everybody, it is difficult for it to be discriminate and proportional. Now, asking the question, are there any weapons in space? There is this. This is actually from a British company. It's a space net, and the idea was that it would grab a dead satellite or space junk to be then encircled in this net and then dragged down into Earth's orbit to burn up in orbit. And the idea was it was a way to deal with, say, old satellites or old pieces of space junk. I mean, there are small pieces of space junk as tiny as a tiny fleck of paint, all the way through an astronaut's glove, which is my favorite piece of space junk, all the way through to large rocket bodies that are still floating around there 50 years after they've been launched. So the idea of the space net was to grab hold of some of that space junk and deorbit it, as I said. But the problem is that any thing that is helping to clean up space debris can also be used as an offensive weapon against military satellites, which means that the problem of space debris and cleaning up space debris is much, much more problematic. And part of the reason this has become problematic is because about 5 years ago, the US, specifically the White House, issued a warning that stated that any action against a US space asset, and it didn't define what that space asset was, so it could be a working satellite, a dead satellite, a piece of space junk. So any action against a US space asset could potentially be considered an act of war against the United States. And so this pronouncement from the US White House meant that people became very nervous about clearing up space debris, space junk, pushing back the problem of clearing space debris by many years, possibly even longer. And I'll talk a little bit more about space debris as we go along. So when we think about, so we have things that can target satellites from in orbit. We also have things that can be targeted terrestrially, so from the Earth up to satellites. So this is actually from Australia, from EOS in Canberra. And the idea is to nudge satellites back into orbit or completely out of orbit at the end of their life, in order to prevent space debris and collisions. They were also looking at the research around burning up small amounts of space debris as well. The problem being, if we go back to the US pronouncement about things, actions against one of their space assets is considered an act of war, then if you accidentally target the wrong satellite, you're kind of causing major diplomatic issues and potentially causing conflict on Earth, so terrestrially. Ironic, something that you do on Earth impacts in space, but then comes back to cause problems back on Earth. So there is some research, I believe, for satellites in orbit that might be able to use lasers to nudge other satellites around, or in order to be used for range finding to do on-orbit servicing. The problem being, again, all of those causes concerns about whether it can be used as an offensive weapon. And so whilst we're thinking about weapons in space, we're thinking about weapons of mass destruction, we're thinking about weapons from space down to Earth and Earth up into space, we need to consider what the broad implications of all of those things might be. And I'll kind of explain that in a minute when I get further on to talk about space debris. So who do we need to worry about in space? As part of a Western alliance through the US and through the European Space Agency, we now have an astronaut who has trained with them, which is very exciting. Through our Western alliance, who are we needing to worry about as potential military operators that might be against us in space? Now, of course, Russia comes to mind. Russia is complicated because the International Space Station obviously is in collaboration with them. And until very recently, the Soyuz capsule, which is what this is the Soyuz capsule docked with the International Space Station. So the Soyuz capsule was taking almost all of the supplies and astronauts, not just Russian astronauts, but everyone, up to the International Space Station and back. And that started happening after the space shuttle was decommissioned, or all of the space shuttles were decommissioned, and before we had SpaceX and Boeing sending their astronauts up into space, and in Boeing's case, kind of accidentally stranding them there. And so we're trying to find a way to ensure that we're not reliant on Russia, because terrestrially, even though in space we are in a mutual arrangement with them, terrestrially we have much more problematic relationships with Russia internationally as a conglomerate. So we do have to be concerned about Russia. And part of that concern is highlighted by the fact that in May this year, so not that long ago, they launched a counter space weapon to impact on US spy satellites. So the other group we need to consider being concerned with is China. So this is the Chinese space station, and they're doing some really amazing things up in the Chinese space station at the moment. We don't get to hear about all of it because of the way things are tied very tightly in China, but we are able to observe some of the things that they are doing, some of the launches that they are doing, some of the things they are doing in space, because we are able to observe them, because the part of the problem about space is everybody can see what you're doing. But they are also problematic. China also seems to have the capacity to remotely operate satellites. They did a test recently with a satellite that snuck up on one of their own satellites, and shadowed that satellite. Now, the idea is that they were testing, what they were saying they were doing was testing on orbit servicing, so being able to repair a satellite whilst in orbit. But the implication, though, is that the same technology could be used to sneak up near US satellites, and they could obviously take that satellite out, they could knock it out of orbit, or they could just degrade their signals just enough that it's problematic to use that satellite, or they could interfere with the signals enough so that they could listen in to what the Americans were using for that particular satellite. So the fact that China now has this capability is very concerning, particularly to the US. And so we're seeing a lot of chatter about this within the military space and general space community. So if we go back to the White House, the US White House releasing this statement about an action against a US space asset is considered an act of war, it's really concerning that China now has the capacity to actually go about doing this. Interestingly, there are some discussions around doing more things collaboratively with China in space. And I think that's coming about because the International Space Station is getting towards the end of its life. And when that is no longer usable, the only human station that will be inhabited will be the Chinese Space Agency. So there's been discussions around how we foster that relationship with China in space in the same way we have with Russia, even when we are having problems with them on Earth. So the other group that we need to worry about in space, Elon Musk is just the gift that keeps on giving for space ethicists like me, because we get to talk about him all the time. The other group that is problematic for us to think about in space are commercial operators. So an example is about 5 years ago, there were 3,500 civilian satellites currently orbiting Earth. And Elon Musk has put up 4,000 satellites since then, with plans to put up almost 40,000 more. So he's putting up mega constellations. And part of in order to bring internet to the world, however, part of that problem is that it creates a huge amount of congestion in space. And also, he's not the only space company that is talking about putting massive space constellations. So in organizations from America, India, and other places are also wanting to put mega constellations up in space. So we go in the space of 10 years from 3.5 satellites in space to 100,000 satellites in space. And unfortunately, for many different reasons, there has been a limited, there is regulation about what these companies can do. However, they have skirted this regulation quite considerably a number of times, which causes problems, which I'll come to in a moment. So how do we regulate all this? I'm going to leave the commercial space regulation to one side. There are overtures on how to make that happen. I'm specifically wanting to talk about the militarization of space. The reason commercial operators are problematic is because, one, they get in the way, and two, they cause space debris that gets in our way. So how do we regulate military operations in space? So first up, the UN is actually doing really good work in this area, but getting consensus on all military space operations is painfully slow, partly because we need to get Russia, China, and the US and all of their allies to agree with each other. And so whilst Australia actually plays a big part in this because we're a middle power, we're able to talk to everybody. However, it is quite slow. And we see that in when we're talking about anti-satellite testing regulations have been very painfully slow to come about. So the other big piece of work that is being done on regulating military space activities is something called the Woomera Manual. And you should all be very proud because it was largely Australian based. It was internationally done, but largely led by a number of people in Australia, including Dale Stevens, who I believe is a Navy commander. And they've just published that just recently. And it's similar to the manual on the International Sea Law for military activities, but for space. And the idea is that we come together internationally to have some norms about what we do in space. And that is moving forward very, very well. So that gives you some hope, but I'm about to shatter that hope. I apologize. So part of my research is on terrorism and space. And I wouldn't recommend becoming a space terrorism researcher because you get randomly selected every time you go through the TSA security line, even though I'm trying to prevent space terrorism. So let's talk about space terrorism. There are many ways to take out the modern world as we know it, particularly by targeting space. So why this is possible is because over the last 15 years, the cost of launching something into space and the cost of making a satellite has dramatically plummeted. The cost has gone through the floor. And so because it has become cheaper, that's great because it means many more companies and many more countries are able to have space assets. However, it does also make it more possible that non-state groups or rogue states like North Korea can do things in space which impacts the whole of the world. And a number of these non-state groups, terrorist groups, want to take us backwards in technology, and so it's very attractive to them. So a member of my research team, Geordie Jacobs, who is a RAFI, he did some research on what would be required to deliberately put up into space a debris field into the orbit of important communication satellites. And to be honest, the answer was terrifying because it was relatively cheap and relatively easy to do. And part of that is because of the explosion of launch facilities, launch companies, and abilities, people who have the ability to put a payload into space that would take out and impact huge amounts of the world has become more and more easy. And the problem with taking out several satellites, big important satellites, is that they create a very large debris field with the potential for something called the Kessler syndrome. And this is where there is a cascade effect with one lot of space debris hitting operating satellites and then causing more space debris that keeps on happening until whole orbits around the Earth are degraded and unusable. Now, we're not at that stage yet, but if you think about it, going from 3,500 commercial satellites to 100,000 satellites increases the risk of that happening. Also, deliberately targeting satellites, so anti-satellite testing that was done by India a few years ago created a massive amount of debris. So it's not just deliberate targeting of satellites by the country that is wanting to test their anti-satellite weapons, but also terrorist groups doing it deliberately. And the reason this is problematic is because space is a dual-use domain, which makes it a very attractive target to non-state groups and to rogue states as well. So why is this problematic? So if a terrorist group or a non-state group could impede the use of satellites in space by creating this debris field, taking out whole orbits, it would take out the internet. And that would impact on communication systems, so no phone reception. And how many of us still have a landline? I definitely haven't for a long time. But more importantly, it impacts on things like there'd be no banking, there'd be no stock market. There would be problems with electricity, gas, and water distribution because they're all internet-based now. Food distribution systems would fall over. And GPS would potentially be affected as well, meaning no navigation for ships and planes unless those people are trained in other navigation techniques. Now, I know that our Navy does that, but commercial shipping may not. And I can't see a 747 pilot working a sextant. So it's very problematic. So if we had a terrorist attack on a number of satellites that deliberately caused debris fields to take out whole orbits, to take out our use of the internet, it would take the world decades to recover, possibly longer. Now, partly as a result of my early research in this, NASA has now strengthened the satellites that they use for Earth observation for space debris, but also for EMP attacks. But there's a limited amount of what you can do for strengthening a small satellite, particularly when we're using CubeSats, against things like that. If one takeaway is that you're worried today about space debris, I'm very happy about that. It's the one thing we need to fix, because it's really climate change 2.0. It has the capacity to dramatically alter the way life is for every person on Earth. So we need to be very careful when we are looking after space, because it's actually quite a fragile environment, to make sure that we don't muck it up. We need to do better. So that's kind of where we're at. I'm only talking about these broad overviews for you because honestly, I could talk for 2 or 3 hours about this. So we haven't talked about the use of space for war. In particular, we haven't talked about satellites being used for intelligence, surveillance, and reconnaissance. We haven't talked about missiles. Intercontinental ballistic missiles actually go through space to land on another continent, and so they are using space for war, even though they're not having an act of an act of aggression in space. It uses that area as it goes somewhere else. We're not talking about the deliberate targeting of satellites today, but the degradation of signals, the pushing out of orbit, or the deliberate targeting of satellites is problematic. The very first thing that would happen if we, and I use we in general terms under AUKUS, if we were going to war with, say, Russia or China, the first thing they would do is take out our satellites and we'd be blind, which is why it's problematic. And then, of course, it would have a flow-on effect because many of the satellites that we use are dual use, in that we buy time on a commercial satellite to be used just for us, but they're also running Telstra or Optus or something else. And so it impacts not just the military organisations in how their ability to respond to terrestrial-based war, it impacts on the local community in how to look after, say, for example, hospitals and so on. We're not going to talk about space as the high ground, but I will say that we talk about high ground in Army particularly, but space, it's a little bit different. Yes, you have the high ground because you can see what's going on. However, the problem of being in space is that everybody can see where you are and everybody can see what you're doing, and so it becomes problematic. And I'm not going to talk about anti-satellites testing.